Ladies and gentlemen around the world, thank you so much for joining us to hear about two of my favorite things. I'm not Julie Andrews, but I do have favorite things. And this webinar is going to bring together the excitement of the multiple indicator cluster surveys and highlighting the fact that there will be at least 70 in this round of the Mix6 and maybe even more. So there is an unprecedented opportunity to be able to, for many, many countries, to be able to have up-to-date information about a whole variety of issues around child protection, all within a fairly close space of time. The first countries doing Mix6 are already showing great interest in this. And in fact, Ghana, which is one of the earlier countries, has already written and said, can we do some special tabulations and investigations of child protection issues from the Mix6? And on the suspicion that they may not be alone, we wanted to touch base with you all this morning to say what could be possible. And to hear from you what where your strongest interests lie and how we can be helpful with the few people that we do have available in headquarters. So I'm sitting here with Cornelius and Samara Chaudhry from the Child Protection section of Program Division, and with Attila and Claudia from Mix and Child Protection areas of data and analytics, and of course Gerald will actually make everything work. So I don't want to trespass on actual substantive time by being too flowering. I just want to say welcome, thank you for joining, and I will hand the floor to Cornelius.
Thank you, Mark, actually. And thank you, colleagues. And we in the child protection section are excited. I recalled being in the field and the negotiations we had to do to get the child protection module of Mix accepted as one of the module, and the investment and the debates and the tension around it, actually. And recently we saw Menaro doing an analysis of their Mix data on violence in the home, actually. We also had an opportunity of having Claudia present to the regional advisors, where she showed actually the increase in countries that are collecting data on violence against children and all the child protection data actually from Mix. Mix and these data are also important because UNICEF has a special accountability for child protection data in the SDGs. And we're under tremendous pressure to demonstrate actually that we are collecting this data. And colleagues, it's a privileged position, a position we in UNICEF would not want to lose. You know, whenever I talk to partners, there are two golden eggs that they are always after. A data ability to collect and analyze data, and our ability to project that data outwards through DOC. They are always after it, wanting to partner with us, right? And of course, we have other colleagues, you know, and the UNFPA who would like to take away the golden egg, you know, but anyway, yeah, I mean, that's an aside. We all 1 year now, and we all work well together. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but what I really appreciate when I heard about Ghana making the request was the professionalism. We're collaborating well with the colleagues in DNA. We have seen some offices spending hundreds of thousands doing things that our colleagues in DNA can do in a couple of days in terms of secondary data analysis and all this kind of work. And we feel actually we are excited that the professionalism is coming to child protection, right? In coming to DNA and seeking their advice before we start doing anything or issuing contracts, okay? So let me turn over to Mark again. Thank you, Mark, for this opportunity. I don't know if my colleague Sumaira has anything to say.
No, I just wanted to greet colleagues who have not had the chance to meet. My name is Sumaira Chaudhry. I'm the Senior Advisor for Planning Evidence Building, working very closely with colleagues in DNA and really excited to be here. So thanks so much for joining, especially those, I know there are a lot of people joining from East Asia and it's very late. So thank you so much.
Good. No, thank you both. And it's very important that we're here together because this is how things work. Is when data and substance meet, then wonderful things can flow. And it seems like we have a drill in the room upstairs, but we're going to ignore that. And I think I'll hand over to Attila now to walk us through a presentation outlining the goodies that are available for us all.
Thank you very much, Mark. While I try to share my screen with you all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I think here comes the presentation. And Gerald is helping with that. Zoom is new to all of us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We're learning as we go.
But the exciting thing is it hasn't crashed yet. So
Yeah.
it's already better than standard.
You did. I think it's a bit.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, I think we're ready to go. Thank you very much. Okay, so we prepared this presentation. We had actually done a similar presentation like 4 or 5 years ago, together with Claudia again on this. But that one was broader about child protection indicators in general, etc. But also had a strong component of mix in that session. But this one specifically about mix, we wanted to focus on mix. So we are going to use most of the time on mix. And while I get this right, okay, now it's working. So there's quite a few slides here, but I'm going to move as fast as possible on these slides, especially on the first parts, and spend a little bit more time on the last part, which is about child protection topics and mix. But I thought that it would be useful to come from a broader context. Maybe talk about child protection indicators and why we need them to begin with. I'll hand over to Claudia for that. Then just a few words about household surveys in general. The mix program itself, an overview. Talk a bit more about the mix structure and the data collection tools. I cannot really miss this opportunity of not talking to you about what's new in mix. We have some exciting new innovations. And last but not least, we're going to be focusing on the child protection topics which are in mix. So without further ado, let me move to Claudia to start, and then I'll take over again.
Thank you, Attila. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Whenever I have to present on child protection data, I always like to start with a very few basic questions that we always have to keep in mind when thinking about the data needs for the sector. First of all, what type of data and evidence more broadly do we need in child protection? Because in the last 10 years, even 15 years, important progress has been made in terms of increasing the availability and quality of data in child protection. But as a sector, we're still struggling with the identification of the data gaps that persist and how to fill the data gaps. But more importantly, as a sector, again, I think we still have a long way to go in integrating the data, making use of the data as part of the work that we do from the programmatic standpoint and from the advocacy standpoint. We have a lot of evidence and data. And mix has been fundamental in producing data across a number of different child protection indicators. So we have, as I said, we have made progress. So we have a lot of data and evidence that we can already use. And I think this webinar is an opportunity to reflect on the data that we already have. And following this is how can we make better use of data that we already have? How can we make better use of the opportunity provided by, for instance, the multiple indicator cluster survey? The experience that we had in the country is that child protection sectors can be extremely powerful in mobilizing resources and attention when there is a dedicated survey that is taking place in a country. We saw this with the back surveys. They created an important opportunity at the country level to talk about issues that were never addressed before. I think we have, with MIX, another great opportunity to bring visibility to certain child protection violations, and we should use this opportunity to mobilize the support at the country level, to create an opportunity to discuss with governments certain topics that were not discussed in the past. And then, of course, when thinking about the gaps that still persist, despite of the progress that we made, how do we make wise investment? How should we get the data that we need in the sector? So when thinking about the type of data and evidence that we need in child protection, we are talking about very different types of information. And there are different data sources that will allow us to get the information that we need. First of all, we need to understand the magnitude in the nature of child protection violations. And to this effect, we need prevalence data. But again, I think going back to 10, even 15 years ago, now we have a much better sense of the magnitude of the problems when it comes to violence, birth registration, child marriage, child labor. But we also need data on the risk and protective factors, on the population who are most likely to be affected by certain child protection violations. And again, to understand magnitude and risk and protective factors, there are some specific data sources that can give us the data that we need. But this is different from getting evidence on how and why certain violations occur and persist. We cannot expect one data source to be able to give us all this type of information, because the nature of the information that we're trying to get is definitely different. When it comes to understanding the why and the how, for instance, qualitative research can be used to better understand the results that we get from prevalence studies, for instance. And again, this is different from the type of data that we need to understand what works and what doesn't work for prevention and response. In this case, research, for instance, specific designs, evaluations are necessary to get us a better sense of what type of programmatic interventions work, for instance, to address the child protection violations, and which conditions need to be in place for the intervention to be effective. And then the last type of data source or type of information that we need are information related that are useful for monitoring and evaluation of programs. To respond to these different data needs, we need to use different data sources. So, and again, I stress this point because sometimes we expect of a household survey to be able to answer all the questions that we have in child protection. Or sometimes we expect that a qualitative studies can give a sense of the what, the how, the why, and can also be used for program monitoring and evaluation. So it's really important that we formulate our research question in a very clear way and we identify the best method to address the research question that we have. Let's think about very quickly about the different sources of data for child protection, starting from administrative data. Obviously, a very important source of information, but this type of data will not allow us to get information about the prevalence or the magnitude of a problem in a country. Even thinking about violence, for instance, this type of administrative data give you an information about the ability of the service, for instance, to identify victims, or the ability of the service or the system to respond to cases of violence, but they definitely cannot be used as indicative of the size of the population of children, for instance, who are victims of violence. Censuses can also be a useful source of information for child protection. Obviously, their nature is such that they cannot accommodate a large number of topics, but censuses can be useful to provide information on current marital status, for instance, for girls, and also give you information about registration. And then we go into surveys, broad categories of surveys. And I'm going to just mention here 2 types of surveys. Attila will talk more broadly about household survey and also specifically about the multiple indicator cluster survey. But the child protection sector has relied heavily in the past on the CAPS surveys, for instance. The CAPS surveys and knowledge, attitude, and practice surveys, they're, again, very useful overall to get an understanding of certain aspects of child protection violations. But I want to stress the fact that there have been problems with standardization and validation of the CAPS survey and the questionnaires that have been used in the CAPS surveys. And again, we cannot expect CAPS surveys to be able to respond to all the child protection data needs. And before jumping into a CAPS survey, it's always important that we evaluate the tools that are used in the survey with the same level of rigor and scrutiny that we would normally do for any other survey. I've also seen the use of school-based surveys to address a number of child protection violations. Again, these are important sources of information. We have the GSHS surveys, for instance, from CDC and WHO that collect a number of information related to school violence, for instance, and other forms of violence as well. But it's always important to remember that these type of surveys, because they are school-based, they do not capture the population of children who are out of school, which might be particularly exposed to certain child protection violations. And the last point I want to make is that when it comes to certain populations of concern from the child protection standpoint, which will include, for instance, children in residential care or children, street children, children who are trafficked for sexual exploitation, children who are associated with the harm group, for instance. In this case, we require special methods, data collection methods. We need different design to capture this population. So blaming a household survey for not covering children in residential care is not a smart strategy, in the sense that this population needs to be captured with special methods again. So we cannot expect one data source to cover all the child protection needs. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to give back the floor to Attila.
And just to continue with what Claudia said, in actual fact, you need all kinds of data to complete the story. You really need to look at a data ecosystem. Each of these data sources are going to be useful for various purposes. You have to use data which is fit for purpose. I think that's important. That applies also to some of the new data sources that we are seeing now cropping up everywhere. Big data and satellite data and other types of new data. Those are very useful indeed, but there's a number of things which are special to household surveys. And we are seeing now that most of the new data sources are actually used in triangulation with household surveys, because some of the properties that household surveys have and offer are actually very critical to understanding, to making more meaning of some of the other data sources. Now, coming to household surveys, we're looking at the following. A representative sample. Most of the data, especially on child protection, is coming from global and regional household survey programs. Their household surveys are relevant to obtain prevalence estimates, associations, trends. That kind of data is really critical to household surveys. And they're very strong on a number of disaggregates, on cultural, social, economic, demographic disaggregates. A number of other features which make household surveys very critical. They're flexible. You can easily adapt the content to emerging issues. One important aspect of household surveys is that they're participatory. They're done on a voluntary basis with participants, with respondents who participate with the intention of providing data, where some of the other data sources, like registration systems, for instance, are not for the purposes of data. They're for administrative reasons, but data is extracted from those systems. In the case of household surveys, and that applies to censuses too, the overall objective is to collect data. And that is agreed by both data collectors and the respondents. And then we're looking at potentially high quality data and comparable data. There's a number of known weaknesses of household surveys. They might not be the best data sources for looking at causality. They might not be as frequent as some of the other data sources. They are not they're not very high resolution. You will not go to the district level, sub-district level all the time. Geographic disaggregation is not the strongest aspect of household surveys. And there are a number of other weaknesses too, including that household surveys do not, by definition, of course, include out-of-household populations, like street children or children in residential care. Having said that, of course, there's a common misunderstanding as if household surveys do not include these children at all. They actually do in many cases, because the household members might be referring to these children, and they might be even listed in the household lists. But a specific effort to collect information specifically about those children are not made in household surveys because of their low frequency as well. Now, what is really important to understand, this is something very special to household survey. I don't think there's any other data source which has this property. Household surveys produce not only factual data, but also behavioral and attitudinal data at the same time, which are robust, representative, high quality, flexible, and with lots of disaggregation. And this is all done at the same time. I don't think there's any other data source which has these properties, which makes household surveys indispensable. So after these few words about household surveys in general, let's come to MIX. As many of you, I'm sure you know, MIX was developed by UNICEF in the 1990s for a specific purpose to provide a tool to the countries to collect data so that they could report on the World Summit for Children goals and indicators in 1995 and 2000. We have continued this program for a number of years. It was very critical for MDG monitoring. It is very important in a number of countries now for national monitoring purposes, national planning purposes. And now MIX is the largest source, definitely on child protection, but probably on comparable data on children internationally of any household survey program. So what we do in the MIX program is can be summarized in 5 different headings. One, we create informed demand at the country level. We coordinate and support the implementation of these surveys, MIX surveys at the country level, which are government owned. This is a very important detail. We carry out methodological work to develop new survey tools, methods, modules, indicators. And talking about indicators, a number of indicators that we have developed over time, as I'm sure you know, have ended up to be SDG indicators. We work with national and international partners to harmonize our data collection tools for avoidance of duplication as well. And finally, we carry out secondary analysis, publish data, disseminate, and we publicly share free of charge microdata on our website. So far, we have completed 314 surveys since 1995 in 117 countries. And this is how it looks over the years, the surveys that we have completed. The numbers at the top for each of those mixed rounds show the number of surveys that were included. The first round was completed with 63 surveys. Mix 5 was completed with 52 surveys. And right now, as Mark already mentioned, we are looking at a large number of surveys. Right now on our website, we have 67 listed. But it is, we know that it's going to go above 70, definitely, maybe over 75. I will show a list of the countries which are participating in a minute, but just to say that over time, we have shifted from emphasis on making sure that countries are able to report for global indicators and goals to government ownership, more sensitivity to the government priorities in terms of data, and inclusion of government prioritized indicators in the surveys. Now, some of the basics. This is mixed surveys are conducted usually, almost always, as part of a UNICEF government cooperation at the country level. We do a joint data gaps assessment. And on a demand basis, we support countries to collect data through the mix. All of the survey activities are carried out by the NSOs, by the National Statistical Offices. We provide, as UNICEF, we provide the standard tools, the standard questionnaires, other data collection tools. They get customized by the implementing agencies at the country level. We provide them technical support during this whole process, and we provide support on off-site support, as well as through workshops through a technical support system to the implementing agencies. Some of the basics include face-to-face interviews. We are now doing only interviews with tablets. We are not using paper questionnaires anymore. As I mentioned, we will always work on representative data. We have standard tools for all survey stages that get customized by the countries. We are now having a target of reporting 6 months after the completion of data collection. We are slowly meeting the target. We're not there yet, but we're gradually moving towards it. As I mentioned, I will mention it again because it's so important. This is with full government ownership. All of the activities are carried out by the government, not by UNICEF. So even to say that UNICEF conducted a mix is by definition a wrong sentence. It's the actual governments who conduct these surveys, but we provide the technical support in this process. These are the mixed 6 surveys. 67 surveys in this round are listed here. As you can see, I will talk over this for a couple of minutes just to give you time to look at the names of these countries. We have a variety of countries here, low income, middle income, upper middle income, and even high income countries. As you can see from the list, not all surveys are necessarily national surveys. Quite a few of them are subnational. Pakistan has 5 surveys running in this round for Balochistan, Punjab, Sindh, KP, and AJK. In 5 countries, we have 2 surveys running at the same time, mainly in ECAR countries, which are all doing national surveys plus Roma surveys at the same time. There are 2 separate surveys. And there's a number of other surveys which are not really national in scope. So this number is 67. We are counting. There's going to be many more coming. We know unofficially the other countries, which are already confirmed, but just because we haven't signed memorandums of understanding with the governments, we are not publicizing them yet. But the number is likely to go above 75. Just a few words on SDGs, because what is powering this huge demand from countries, one of the reasons powering this huge demand from countries for conducting mixed surveys, I think, is SDGs. Our ability to cover 33 SDG indicators, which are about half of all SDG indicators that can come from household surveys. We cover these SDG indicators under 11 different goals. And as you can imagine, many countries who are trying to collect data for SDG reporting purposes for their baselines are really interested in using this tool to come up with as many indicators as possible. And several of these, as you know, are child protection related indicators, for child marriage, FGM, child labor, feeding safe, child discipline, birth registration, etc. And several of these, I will point out once again, have been developed either by the MIXED program in collaboration with other programs or international partners. So we have really had a lot of salt in the soup, if you like, in defining the SDG indicators related to children.
Can I just ask a question here? What's in the discrimination and the feeling state?
I will come to that. That's coming at the end of the year presentation. In terms of the content, let's talk about the content a little bit. But since we get these questions all the time, and what goes into mix, why doesn't subject X has not gone into mix? Why has something else made it into mix? There's a number of factors that influence our decisions to include topics in mix. First, UNICEF priorities and problematic relevance, of course, needless to say. Second, country demand. Since these are surveys owned by the countries, we try to take into account as much as possible, given technical considerations, the demand from the countries in terms of what should go into mix. We prioritize SDG indicators in this round, and most of our technical work has been on SDG indicators, validation work, etc. We have to know beforehand that we will be able to collect good quality data. For this purpose, we need to validate, test measurement tools before we actually include them in mix and roll them out to the countries. We pay attention to eligibility and general structure. Something that might be added to mix might be having implications in terms of huge changes in the overall structure, which might not work. So that's something to consider. And obviously, very importantly, whatever is being added or included in mix should be appropriate for household survey methodologies. Events or cases which are very rare, which are very difficult to capture through a household survey with any kind of statistical precision, are usually topics and issues which have to be covered by other data sources, by not household surveys. And I must say that over time, improvements in our own ability to provide technical support, both on-site and off-site, to the countries, has made us a little bit more ambitious in terms of what we cover in mix. From 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we couldn't have imagined that we would be talking to children and doing foundational learning assessments of children on reading and mathematics, but we are now able to do it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we couldn't have imagined that we would be doing one day water quality testing in mix. We couldn't have imagined even that we would be doing birth stories in mix. 10, 15 years ago, we were very conservative about these things because we knew that we would be just providing tools to the countries and we would be leaving them on their own to tackle these very challenging topics to cover in mix. Nowadays, because of the improved ability, in our case, to provide technical support, we are much more ambitious in terms of what we can cover in the mix surveys. I will skip through some of these slides just to say that field work usually these days takes about 2 to 4 months. Sample sizes are on the average 11,000 with a lot of variation from one country to another. Our target, as I mentioned, is to release all the results of the survey within 6 months of completion of fieldwork. And we have 2 main products to begin with in mix. One of them is a survey findings report, and the other one is snapshots on specific themes. I think we have 21 of them. Some of them, many of them, are child protection related. 2 or 3 pages with visual representational results with key messages on the findings of the survey. And finally, we anonymize the microdata sets with the countries, and they give us the go-ahead to share the microdata sets on our website for third-party users to download and do their own analysis. Our starting point is indicators, is a set of indicators, and the questionnaires, the standard questionnaires that we have, are all constructed around these indicators. We need to make sure that all our questions in the questionnaires contribute to a numerator or a denominator of an indicator that we have been trying to estimate. These are the questionnaires. At present, this is mixed 6 questionnaires. A household questionnaire we start with, and from there on, we identify individuals, women 1549, men 1549, and we identify mothers and caretakers of children from 0 to 17, and we have 2 separate questionnaires, one under 5 questionnaire for those people, and one questionnaire for children, about children age 5 to 17, which is the new questionnaire that we have in MixX. In addition to these questionnaires, we do a number of measurements. We look at iodine content in salt. We do water quality testing, and we do anthropometry for under 5s. Plus, something brand new in Mix 6, we are now doing foundational learning assessments by directly engaging with children and giving them tests on reading and mathematics, which is also contributing to a SDG indicator. So this is the overall structure of the questionnaires. And these are the contents in summary. The ones which are underlined are of special interest to the child protection community, I would think. You can see that there's a huge number of topics. This is much more busier than we used to have in the previous rounds of mix. You can always go to our website, of course, and have a look at these in more detail. I had mentioned that disaggregation is a strong feature of household surveys in general, and of mix in particular. And you can see in the box there the typical disaggregate that we use for almost all of the indicators that we report on. Okay. Innovations, new stuff, exciting stuff. We have 4 projects that I will briefly mention, but before going there, let me mention some of the things that we have done in terms of development of indicators and what we're about to do. The topics on the left and the indicators on the left are all those that we have contributed to the development of, or the modification or improvement of, in the recent years. Some of them were for the first time included in mix on child discipline, for instance, which has made its way into the SDGs. Child labor, I will talk later, was a collaboration with ILO. So for many of these, we spend a lot of time nowadays in the field testing, validating measurement protocols. On the right are things which are coming up. Next month, we are going to Belize for another field test. The highlight of the field test is going to be time use of children. I'm sure that's a topic which is multi-sectoral, which would be many sectors in UNICEF would be interested in that issue. We are finalizing the development of our post-emergency module, which would help us to generate information on populations affected or unaffected by emergencies. We are looking at a new measure on early childhood development. And last but not least, in the Belize field test, we will be looking at education, employment, and training of adolescents and young people. So this is something exciting coming up. But there are 4 initiatives which are very exciting at this point. One of them is Mix Tabulator. Mix Tabulator is an online tool that we are developing to give access to users to harmonize mixed microdata from all countries and all rounds, starting from Mix 2, so that they can go to the website and produce cross-tabulations, graphs, and maps without having to use any sophisticated statistical software. That is going to, we hope, revolutionize the amount of use of mixed data, both internally in UNICEF as well as externally. Second is MixLink. We are looking at a suite of methods that will enable us to link mixed data with administrative data, with facility data, with censuses, and with other surveys. We have one pilot test of this coming up in one country, looking at merging administrative data on health with the mixed data that we are going to be collecting. Third, Mix Plus, probably the highlight of all of these, for some colleagues at least. Mix Plus is a simple idea. We are going to be testing it for the first time in the field in Belize. It's basically to complete mix, a proper mix survey, then select a subsample of the respondents of the mix, and to continue collecting data at frequent intervals via mobile phones from those subsample representative respondents on various issues, including for opinion polling purposes, for crisis monitoring purposes, for collecting longitudinal data in general. And we also have mixed GIS, not a complete new innovation, but just to give you the news that we are going to be collecting and compiling GPS coordinates of survey clusters from now on in all mixed surveys if the government agrees to do so. And then we will displace, do the necessary displacement and anonymization of the data and conduct a lot of analysis on the basis of that. I have 15 minutes and I come to the last section on child protection. This is the main topic that we were going to cover, of course, which is very important. On the right, you see the topics which are child protection related, which come under a child protection indicator list in the mix. I will cover each of these separately. On the left, I have put a number of topics which I included in mix, which are of specific relevance, I would think, to the child protection community, including living arrangements and orphanhood, child functioning, child-headed households, attitudes towards domestic violence, etc. And I will, at the very end, say something about sexual violence, inclusion in mix. Let's start with birth registration. This is something that has been included in mix since mix 2. Therefore, we go all the way back to 2000. These are basically questions on whether the child has a birth certificate or whether the child is registered with civil authorities. The interviewer is asked to see a certificate. And we also ask about knowledge on whether the mother or caretaker knows how to register the birth. Over time, we used to have a question on reasons for non-registration. We dropped that question recently, I think 2 rounds ago, because we were not getting much out of it. In most countries, the numbers who are not registered were very small. Therefore, we were not getting any statistical precision. Second, the respondents were not really in a position to, we're interviewing mothers and caretakers, and they were not in the best position to respond to this question, and we were of the opinion that the answers that we were getting were not all that good quality. Again, we said earlier that household surveys are not the best tools for looking at why questions for causality. So some qualitative work, I think, is needed to complement findings from the mix in terms of reasons for non-registration. And this is an SDG indicator whose definition is on the left, as you can see. On child labor, we used a non-standard module until the end of mix 3. We were using a roster of all children at the time. Then we got together, and there was a lot of complaints and criticisms to mix in the way that we were collecting the data. We got together with ILO before mix, at the time of mix 4, I think, and harmonized our efforts, which we came up with a module which is as consistent as possible with what they're doing in their SIMPOC, they were doing in their SIMPOC surveys. I think they're defunct now, as far as I know. Now it has become, some countries may be doing it, but I think the main support coming from ILO, as far as I can understand, is going to be adding on child labor specific modules, sometimes on labor force surveys, rather than running a SIMPOC child labor survey program. So that makes mix a even more critical data source for child labor monitoring. This is what the module that we have now is part of the 517 questionnaire. It is administered to mothers and caretakers. We still have some differences with the ILO survey estimates, and I think there's need for further analysis to understand those differences in some cases. And we basically look at economic activities, work in hazardous conditions, and household chores. And the reference period is 1 week for that indicator. And the indicator is calculated on the basis of age-specific thresholds that you can see on the next slide, but just to say that this is, as you all know, an SDG indicator. So for each age band inside the 5 to 17 age group, there's a number of thresholds for each of these three activities, economic activities and household chores. If the child is working under hazardous conditions, then regardless of the age, the child is regarded to be engaged in child labor. On child discipline, we are collecting child discipline data both in the under 5 questionnaire as well as the 5-17 questionnaire, because the indicator covers the age group 1 to 14. Respondents are mothers and caretakers. We ask whether any adult member of the household has used any of the listed disciplinary practices during the last 1 month before the survey. We ask about 8 violent disciplinary practices, 2 of them psychological, 6 of them physical, and 3 non-violent disciplinary practices. The further analysis work by MENA that Cornelius was talking about earlier is based on this module. And in addition to asking about the questions on what happened in last month, we also ask a question about the respondents' attitude towards physical punishment to end the module. And this is the indicator. We put in a denominator those children who have experienced any physical or psychological aggression by adults, caregivers in the past month. Child marriage is an all-timer, I would say. It was included in Mix 3 for the first time. We collect data for both women and men in Mix through a marriage module. We have questions on current status, past experience, including timing and polygyny, as well as the age of spouse. And we customize the questionnaires to capture not only formal civil marriages, but also consensual unions and other types of unions, such as visiting unions. And the mix, we have 4 mix indicators. One of them is the SDG indicator at the top for both men and women. And we have the other 3 very critical, important indicators. Female genital mutilation is another topic which is included in some surveys, of course, where FGM is prevalent. The data is collected in the women's questionnaire. For respondents, we ask about knowledge, whether they have been subjected to FGM, the age at which that happened, the type of procedure, the performer. We ask to the same respondents about their daughters, age 0 to 14, so as to be able to get information on most recent practices, again on status, type, age, and performer. And we also ask the respondents their attitudes towards continuation of the practice in their countries. We introduce questions on all daughters only in Mix 4. Before that, we were collecting censored information. But also, as a caution, I think it should be fair to say that the observations that we have for daughters through the mothers should be regarded as censored prevalence estimates, because many of those children are still at the risk of being mutilated. So it's not completed observation. And these are the 3 indicators that we have in Mix. Earlier there was a question already from Sumaira on crime reporting and feeling safe. We included these questions for the first time in Mix 6 for 2 reasons. One, the demand coming from countries, because these are SDG indicators. Secondly, the demand coming from some of our countries, especially in the Latin American region. We tried to work as much as possible with UNODC, looking at their victimization surveys. I wouldn't go as far as saying that we are replicating what they're doing, but we tried to use the validation and experience from those surveys. We tested the module. This is called a victimization module in Mix. It's on feeling safe. on exposure to crime. We basically look at assaults and robberies that happened in the last 12 months to both men and women. This is, of course, an important topic, not only because it's an SDG indicator, but because administrative sources are usually very insufficient and unreliable in this topic. Therefore, this is proving to be very useful for countries. We ask about assaults and robberies, the circumstances, the timing, it's a long set of questions that we actually use for this purpose. And we come up with these 3 indicators, 2 of which are SDGs. It's about reporting these cases to the police, one of the indicators. And the other one is the percentage of people feeling safe walking alone in their neighborhood after dark. These are a one-to-one consistent with the SDG definitions. And of course, we generate information on the experience of robbery and assault during the last 12 months.
And presumably for that one, you can disaggregate by rural, urban.
Absolutely. Everything that you see here can be disaggregated wherever relevant by all the disaggregates that I showed earlier. Sex, age, rural, urban, ethnic state, ethnicity, cultural background, educational level, migration status, disability status. I can go forever. There's a huge number of disaggregates. Just to finish up, in Mix 6, a handful of countries are now including modules, have included modules on violence that will help them to produce indicators on sexual violence against girls and women. This is a handful of countries. It is very challenging for us, for the profiles of our technical support group, as well as the implementing agencies, to make sure that the ethical considerations are placed in this, the right training is provided. So we are working with others like UNFPA and others to make sure that the module is properly included and administered in the mix. Typically, we are including the DHS module. We're adding it to the mixed questionnaires. It's only a handful of countries for the time being, 3 or 4 countries, but in the future, we have the intentions of working towards making this an integral part of mix, possibly in mix 7. We're going to be looking at possibilities on this one. I'll finish here. Please go to our website, which is mix.unicef.org. Almost everything that I've mentioned is there. You can download the reports, data sets, questionnaires, any tool that we have touched upon in this presentation. So thank you very much for your attention. And we stop here, I think. I think we have a number of questions.
Yes. So first, I just want to mention that the presentation and the recording will be sent out.
Unfortunately, we run out of time, but we would like to give them an opportunity to colleagues
With burning questions to ask them. So please do write them in the chat or unmute yourself. You can use 1-2 minutes for questions. And apologies for having taken so much time.
I see one question, which is where exactly the new set of indicators on crime reporting and commit safe, where it covers the country,
Which countries?
covered in this module on crime reporting and commit safe.
I think let me quickly answer that. I think what's important to understand is countries take these questionnaires and they customize them. In many cases, they take out modules which might not be of any priority to them, or they might not think that it's applicable to them, so they would take out those. It can be for various reasons. On technical grounds, we will discuss with them to keep things in, if necessary, if we think technically it's needed. On political choices, it is the country's call, of course. So for each of the modules, the inclusion in surveys is going to vary. I think victimization modules are included in most of the countries at present, but we don't have all the questionnaires, so we will have to wait a little bit longer to have a specific list of which countries included which module. If there's if there's a burning question on that, you can, colleagues can always reach out to us, and we can give them the information.
Okay. Three more questions. One is, how can a country be part of a Mixed Plus initiative?
Let's have the other question.
Is there any way to have some modules that can be integrated in the DHS? Then financial estimate, possible funding sources if the government is willing to do it, but can't because of economic downturn or fiscal state. Can you tell us a bit more about the post-emergency module? Oh, goodness.
Okay, let me go very quickly.
Repeat the question, yeah.
On Mix Plus, we are going to be at the pilot testing stage for a couple of years. We are testing in Belize on a confined area of a limited number of districts. Then we are going to go for a national pilot at the end of this year. We don't think that Mix Plus is going to be something standard for each and every mix survey, but we will see how we develop this and what the demand is going to be from countries. On funding, most of the funding in mixed surveys now is provided by the governments themselves, as well as the UNICEF country offices. UNICEF headquarters comes in to cover shortfalls in funding, but in many cases, we get a lot of funding from other international agencies. It is very important to emphasize that since I showed the content of Mix, which has a lot to do with other agencies, it is important that this is seen at the country level as a global public good, and other UN agencies and donors are invited to join forces and support the funding of these surveys.
And there are two more that I think we need to have. Just quickly, is there any way to get some integrated in the DHS?
Absolutely, a number of countries do it, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this. One of the, and Claudia will correct me if I'm wrong, one of the data poorest regions in the world on child protection indicators, as we have them mixed or in the SDGs, are East Asia, East Africa, East and Southern Africa. That's mainly because there's a lot of DHS surveys there. We don't do mixed surveys, and there's limited possibilities of adding these modules onto a DHS survey.
Then last question we have time for is the post-emergency module. Could you say a bit more?
Sure. There's actually a page on that one on the Mix website. Colleagues can go there and read the very simple documentation that we have. It's basically about inclusion of a module in Mix after an emergency has happened to look at the possibility of identifying populations which have been affected by emergency or not affected, and using it as for disaggregation purposes, as well as understanding the situation post-emergency in the countries on a number of indicators, looking at emergency affectedness status.
Question about use of tablets. Is there any more data real-time data access?
No, I wouldn't say either of those. I think tablets make it come up with cleaner data. In theory, it should be quicker to come up with the final data sets. But unfortunately, as we have experienced from many, many surveys, the main responsible factors for delays in coming up with the findings of the survey is not whether paper has been used or tablets have been used. It's actually to do with other processes which happen after data collection. But this is the way to go, and this is what we're doing in all the surveys. And it makes fieldwork easier in some ways too.
Okay. I think the last question, there's one, yes, there's something about, is it possible to drop modules if topics are sensitive?
Absolutely. Well, it is the government's call in the end. As UNICEF, we will do our best to develop our technical arguments, point out to data gaps. Remember, we start a mixed adventure with the countries based on a data gap assessment. If we feel, from our point of view as UNICEF, as advocates for children's data, if we feel that a certain type of data is really important for the country to collect, we will develop our technical arguments. But the ultimate decision will be made by the governments, not by us.
I think that's a really great point to end on. There is a request for more documentation on the countries that gather data on sexual violence. That's probably more, I think, for you and me to follow up on, and we do the follow-up message. My side, I just wanted to say thank you, Fadia and Attila, for organizing this and taking the time. Fadia, over to you for last concluding remarks.
Yes. So thank you so much, Attila, Sumaira, and Cornelius. Just a quick mention. First of all, we continue to do methodological work on modules, and specifically on sexual violence. We have established the interagency expert group on BAC with national statistical offices that we will work together to refine and develop new questions on sexual violence in childhood that can be integrated overall in surveys. So methodological work is ongoing to address the data gap. Also, we are working on a template that can be used by country once there is a survey like mix on child protection, so that the data can be extracted easily and can be included in a publication. So we have done this for Cambodia, we are doing this for Ghana, and we are going to transform this into a template so that the country can generate automatically a dedicated publication on child protection using a mixed data set. So let's continue the conversation. Let's be in touch. You know where you can find us, and please do be in contact with HQ when it comes to mix in child protection or more broadly child protection data, because we are always here ready to assist you. Thank you very much, and we are going to be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, thank you.